Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I hope you guys had a good break and everybody's doing okay. I know that there's a lot going on, and we are going to kind of keep on rolling with some of the activities that we started before break. But this is a video that's really designed to introduce you even further to some of the new monarchs. These are largely princes or kings. They kind of are interchangeable in the time period of the Renaissance, from four different places: England, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. By the 1500s, we see these to be the strongest societies in Western Europe. Kind of the leaders of these particular places, maybe with the exception of the Holy Roman Empire, but at least with England and France and Spain, we see a lot of centralization of the government underneath one particular leader, and we see societies moving a little bit, at least, toward this concept of like a modern day nation state. So as that starts to happen, wealth and power starts to become controlled by kings, and we see these particular societies, England, France, and Spain in particular, really active also in the New World. So some of the activities that are run by the state will include things like colonial type enterprises. So just a little bit of context. This is a map that explains the 100 Years' War without going into a ton of detail about the topic. This involves both France and England. And over the course of 100 years, kind of in the later Middle Ages, this is really a conflict that has phases in it, where France and England are largely fighting over land. Some of this is about England's claims to land in France, and they're also fighting about who should be the leader of France. There are two powerful families in England and in France. In France, the Capetians, and in England, the Plantagenets, and both of them are after power in France. And so when England kind of challenges France for the throne, they go toe-to-toe in a series of conflicts. So if you look up here, if you can see the cursor up here, early on in the war in 1337, England, which is green, has a little bit of land. As the war continues, England starts to win. England knights had the advantage of the longbow, so weaponry-wise, there's a huge set of battles where England is actually the early winner. Then, as the war continues, we see England try to lay claim to more land, but they start to lose some of their larger claims in this area right here. And part of this push for France is under the spiritual guidance of Joan of Arc, who kind of stands up and will lead Charles VII as the king. He's like kind of really the king to be. There becomes a movement of France under a much more unified sense. Joan of Arc is a part of that. She gets put to death. It's not really clear that she's a soldier during the war, but she definitely serves as somebody who is trying to build morale for France and inspire people to fight. As she does that, and people start to identify, with uniquely being French, we see by the end of the 100 Years' War that England has lost a great deal of land and France has gained. And so some of the effects of the 100 Years' War, gives you kind of a visual image, are things that we would expect, because a lot of the new weapons, there's less of a need for those knights and for feudalism in general. We see during the 100 Years' War, France creating taxes so that they can hire a military. And so this like centralized state role, or a military that exists under the king, and the king with certain powers starts to become the new model. So you don't have those feudal nightly battles that are happening in smaller groups. This is going to become a much more kind of statewide military. The French are largely going to feel very sovereign after the war. They're identifying with being French. The political boundary is much more clearly France versus England. Before this war, many people in England actually spoke French. The leaders spoke French, a lot of the nobles spoke French, they owned land in France, so the two societies were very intertwined. Not the case. And as a result of some of this nationalism to a degree. It's not quite nationalism the way we would recognize it, but there is a sense of that. We have a stronger French bureaucracy as well. So the first leader after the Hundred Years' War is going to be Louis XI, and he is going to have this capability of a strong army, high taxes, and he will be in power basically by the applause of the merchant class. In England, there's a rise in the power of the parliament, so this is a check on the king. There's a lot of fear that maybe the king had been the reason for the loss of the war, and there's actually a civil war in England after the 100 Years' War, known as the War of the Roses. This particular civil war is essentially a war between two noble families to decide kind of the future of England, and this context sets up the new monarchs. And even though the new monarch will happen later in England than in France, in time, England will also see a rise of a more centralized monarch. In France, just to give you some of the cast of characters, this very interesting picture on the top right here is Louis XI, or the Spider King. If you choose to look into him after class for that activity that's noted in the Schoology site, if you look into him, you'll see he's kind of interesting. He was somebody who was really interested in some deals. He was an enemy of Charles the Bold, and what Louis XI really wanted was a land that France could not seem to get, which was Burgundy. Charles the Bold was kind of leading an independent Burgundy and wouldn't fall under France. And in time, Louis XI acquired Burgundy, so we kind of get some credit for that. He also creates a very large royal army. He's known for really pushing back against nobles, increases taxes a great deal, and he's encouraging economic growth. So he's seeing kind of the role of the centralized king. You know, he is not an absolute king. He doesn't have absolute power by any means, and there's still some lands that are not falling under his rule, but he is acquiring power, and was known as kind of a cold fish kind of guy. Following Louis XI is Francis I, who is a very colorful character. It's this photo down here. He is like the Renaissance king. He's like a humanist. He brings the entire Italian Renaissance to France, huge patron of the arts. He also works very carefully with the Roman Catholic Church, puts basically the church underneath the crown. So part of his tactic is to ensure that he can pick the leaders of the church, and when there becomes a huge Protestant Reformation, one place we don't see that taking hold is where the church has kind of been moved under the crown, and we see that largely in France. In England, we do see the War of the Roses. This is that civil war between two noble families. So in the mid-1400s, this is going to be a civil war between two families, the Yorks and the Lancasters. It's called the War of the Roses because the Yorks, they're kind of, pictorial slogan, why I can't remember the word for that, is a white rose. Their symbol is a white rose, and the Lancasters is a red rose. And so these kind of houses are represented by that. And Henry VII, right, who's ultimately going to be significant because we'll all be familiar with Henry VIII, who's his younger brother. But Henry VII is kind of like this outlier guy, and he happens to get involved in a marriage and pulls the Yorks and the Lancasters together. So this creates the first of a new dynasty after this back and forth war between the Yorks and the Lancasters. Henry VII, or sometimes called Henry Tudor, comes to power, and he's kind of a quiet leader. Historians largely give Henry Tudor a great deal of credit. It's this guy over here. He does start the Tudor monarchy. It will be in England for some time. And he is somebody who really curtails the power of the nobility. He is known for creating a separate court, so if nobles were brought to court, They were brought essentially to this special court of the king and held there, and there wasn't a whole lot that could be done if nobles were found to be guilty. He kind of had his own rules for nobles. He also was incredibly involved in the English treasury. So probably the ways in which Charles VII is most sophisticated is in creating a degree of wealth for the English crown. And we get a sense of the king and parliament kind of working toward developing kind of more rules for the treasury. Parliament will continue to wield a great deal of power over the purse, but we see Charles very, very involved in actively kind of taking hold of the economy, and he's involved in a great deal of productivity, getting England to be incredibly productive. He is kind of moving England into the Renaissance, and he is fairly successful. The picture on the bottom, of course, is Henry VIII. He is really a Renaissance king, much larger personality than his brother. He is somebody who is probably most known for taking England over to the Anglican Church. He will refuse to continue the Roman Catholic Church, so he will upend the state religion in England. He also, during his reign, will have multiple marriages. He creates the church, the Anglican Church, largely because he wants to divorce his first wife, and he has 6 in total. So if you're interested in checking out Henry VIII, by all means, check him out. The power couple of Ferdinand II and Isabella, they also are new monarchs, and Spain is kind of in an interesting place. They take on the tactic of getting married in 1469, and Ferdinand, who rules Aragon, and Isabel, who rules Castile, will essentially bring the society of Spain together. It is not quite Spain as we know it. Not all of the regions of modern-day Spain are under Isabel and Castile, and they essentially rule both regions together. They're not really ruling Spain, but this power marriage is common amongst lots of the leaders of the day. People are ruling and growing more powerful because they're marrying and getting more land that way. We're familiar with Ferdinand and Isabella because of Christopher Columbus. They will patronize his entire expedition to the New World, and so we see in 1492 a great deal of activity with the Spanish flag kind of continuing the essential, party that they had been working on with the new monarchs. We see them bring some of those initiatives to what will become New Spain, largely in South America, also in partly North America. In 1492, we see huge actions against Muslims in particular. The Reconquista really targets 2 groups in favor of greater land. So by 1492, the same year that Columbus is involved in the New World, Moors or Muslims are driven out of Spain. So the last Muslim stronghold is in the southern part of Spain in Granada. And, we see basically a model where the 2 leaders have essentially created political unity by ensuring that they could first get religious unity. In order to have everyone underneath them and to follow them as new monarchs, these leaders do 2 things. Ferdinand and Isabella will kind of combine with the Roman Catholic Church. They will also be picking leaders of the church, and they will enable the church to participate in inquisitions in order to essentially oust people who are not Catholic. And this is going to affect largely 2 groups, including Muslims and Jews, whose land is taken as part of the Reconquista, but we also see the Spanish Inquisition. And Spain is not the only place where we see the Roman Catholic Inquisition. In some cases, in England, for example, it was about getting, clergy to not be corrupt, and it's supposedly an effort to remove Catholic heretics, people who are not religious and are supposed to be. In Spain, anyone who was seen as non-Catholic, and this would include Muslims and Jews, could be considered heretical and could be victimized by the Inquisition. Jews in particular were told to leave Spain unless they converted, and if they did not convert and did not leave, they were subject to death. And this group of Jews known as conversos, and in some cases Muslims also, who said that they would also convert, these groups were tortured, and in a lot of cases the Inquisition really